Taking 4 months to make one video. Oh, what's this? Matthewmatosis uploaded a new video. Well, there's something you don't see every year. I wonder what it's about. Oh, you procrastinating bastard, I read your book! So yeah, it finally happened. Matthewmatosis made a video about Breath of the Wild, as so many people have been begging him to do for 2 years. You may recall, if you're one of the several people who watched my last rebuttal, that I ended it with this. Matthewmatosis still hasn't commented on his opinions vis-a-vis Breath of the Wild, but now that he's updating again, he'll probably take a whack at it. I hope he does. While I disagree with him on many things, I value his opinion and want to know where he stands. Well, now we know, and in marked contrast to many of his other long videos, he clearly liked this game. A lot. I might even go so far as to say he gushed. And he's not even full of hot liquid like I am, so that's impressive. There's just one problem, which you've probably already guessed. I don't agree with his take on Breath of the Wild at all. It actually came as a huge shock. There were several points in his video where I was amazed at the stuff that was coming out of his mouth. The only time I can remember disagreeing with him this much is, well, the last time he talked about Zelda 6 years ago. Now, most people would probably just leave an enormous comment on his video and leave it at that. But I'm not just some 3-subscriber scrub anymore. Now I'm an 11-subscriber scrub. Nearly a dozen people took the time to click on a button on a web page to show how much they trust me, and I won't let them down. So this is going to work basically the same way it did last time. I'll put up timestamps for various points in Matt's video so you can hear what sounds like me interrupting him in real time to say that he's wrong about stuff. I'll be summarizing his points before each rebuttal, so you don't actually have to watch his video at the same time if you don't care to. Or if, what's more likely given our relative subscriber bases, you've already seen his videos several times. Okay, enough preamble. Let's pick apart some arguments. So we begin with a sweeping claim that really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Yes, it's true that Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword followed a basic template of 3 relatively simple dungeons, followed by a world-changing event, a larger number of more challenging dungeons, and then a big boss fight in a palace of some kind. But this is only a template in the broadest and least interesting sense of the word, and more importantly, even though many people seem to forget this, there are other Zelda games that don't follow this pattern at all. Majora's Mask wasn't married to this design, neither was Minish Cap, or any portable Zelda for that matter. Matt can claim that all Zeldas before Breath of the Wild felt samey if he wants, and it seems to be a major part of his thesis, but I don't agree. Matt's always struck me as a rather harsh and demanding critic, so imagine my surprise when he declares himself to be bowled over by a whole 2 different ways you can use Spirit Orbs in Breath of the Wild. Never mind the fact that in previous Zelda games there were many different optional upgrades to Link's abilities that you could seek out in whatever order you wanted. That kind of player freedom apparently doesn't count because the games are so linear otherwise, even when they're not. Okay, but because players aren't punished for making strange food combinations, the result is a system that gives you a big bonus no matter what you do, so it comes down to just clicking and waiting with barely any thought involved. The cooked food is also, and I know this is subjective here, really boring. I don't see how putting meat and fish in a pan and getting meat and seafood fry is somehow an amazing culinary discovery. The recipes in Paper Mario, just to compare, involved a lot more creative thinking on the part of the designers, didn't break the game's healing system, and had funny and interesting descriptions that actually made them feel like a discovery. Apparently Matt can't build this game up without putting the rest of Zelda down. I happen to like a lot of Zelda tutorials, even the widely maligned ones from Twilight Princess. They're atmospheric, they help to set up the story, and unlike the Great Plateau, there's usually a reason why Link is learning something that ties into broader themes, not just a series of glorified playpens apparently built by plot convenience magic. That really depends on what you mean by engaging. If we're talking about Portal-style mechanical intricacy, then Matt is probably right here, but Zelda puzzles have almost never gone in that direction. Maybe this is just a semantic quibble, but engaging to me often feels like a fancy way of saying good. It's a subjective value judgment. I've always found Zelda puzzles very engaging, and the wide range of tools you get makes you wonder what's coming next. Having 6 tools for the whole game isn't necessarily more robust than having 24 that you acquire one by one. Every good Metroidvania stands as proof of that. I actually agree with this, although I wouldn't use the word perfect because, again, value judgment. Shrine puzzles are too clean and too obvious pretty much across the board. Distinguishing what's relevant from what isn't is an essential part of problem solving. That's why you'll find it in the reading comprehension section of your SAT. Earlier Zelda games, because their puzzles were set in a realistic-looking environment, had plenty of noise to distract you and make the puzzle more interesting. Breath of the Wild shoves it all into sterile, artificial-looking shrines that were clearly designed to be solved, like giant puzzle boxes made by the gods. It's condescending, and worse than that, it's lazy design. Oh boy, this again. I went over this in my first rebuttal, but Zelda is not a series for the faint of brain. Furthermore, breaking a puzzle does not prove that you are smart. On the contrary, it proves that the level designers were dumb, or at least didn't think enough about what they were making. When players find it easier and more fun to avoid your puzzle than to solve it, you've made a bad puzzle. Let's just leave aside the question of whether a place being overcast and freezing cold while another place a few miles away on the same day is bright and balmy is actually believable. That's another subjective question. What I really don't like here is the assumption that a mechanic that takes away health unless you go into the menu and swap out your clothes constitutes mechanical richness. Any mechanic that makes you stop the game and make an obvious choice is not rich. It's tedious padding. By way of contrast, look at the poison swamps you often find in the Souls games. These are very similar to Breath of the Wild's hot and cold areas. You go into a new environment, get slapped with a status ailment, and have to take steps to treat it. In the Souls games, though, there's no pausing the action. You have to deal with the poison in real time, while fighting enemies, so there's a lot to think about. Do I have time to heal? Can I afford to live with the poison until it's safe to fix it? Do I even want to waste my rare poison healing items when I could tough this out? I'm actually not a big fan of these areas myself, but you can't deny that they offer a unique challenge. Meanwhile, Breath of the Wild just makes you pause, click on a non-consumable quick fix for your problem, and move on with your day. This is a decision only in the loosest sense of the word. A rare bit of criticism from this video, and one I wish he'd gone into a bit more. This is a serious problem, so I have no idea why he just glosses over it like this. In the earlier Zeldas, this would have been less worrisome, because they're not combat-focused, but Breath of the Wild is, so I expected better. Given how much Matt gushes over the good stuff, he could have been a little more expansive when talking about this kind of thing. If the extrinsic rewards don't do their job of making a camp clear out fun, then why are they there at all? You would think that a game with such obvious intrinsic appeal would be able to just put enemies in the world with no rewards, and the player would fight them just to have fun, right? But that's not how sandboxes are designed. They're full of garbage collectibles and other shallow extrinsic rewards that encourage repetitive, carbon-copied content consumption. When Matt shows Wind Waker footage while talking about unnecessary pickups, I can't help but feel that he's projecting. Breath of the Wild does this worse, not better, than the rest of the series. This is the single biggest bone of contention I have with Matt, and possibly the only aspect of his two Zelda think pieces which actually offends me. It's true that Zelda's stories aren't terribly complicated. You don't have the dozens of plot twists, deep character exploration, and political intrigue that you could get in a 120-hour-long RPG. That does not mean that the stories are bland, stupid, or not worth thinking about, all of which are connoted by the word simplistic. Ocarina of Time was probably the single most intelligent game released for the N64. It had a cast of half a dozen major characters, all of whom were interesting and full of personality. It drew on a wide range of emotional tones, both happy and somber, and had a narrative that made sense in a world that was fascinating to discover. The story and the gameplay worked together to create an impression, and it's sad that I have to point that out as a rare and special quality, because it ought to be part of every game. I'm a big fan of Zelda games, and it's never been because the combat blows me away or because I think the puzzles are particularly ingenious. It's because of each game's unique atmosphere, world, and story, all of which are worth exploring. When you strip the story out of a Zelda game, you rip out its soul. I've said before that I value Matthewmatosis' opinions on games, and for the most part that's still true, but when it comes to this particular nothing burger of a criticism, he's lost me. Here's another one that I agree with, but I don't know why Matt believes this. See, the thing is that most games, open world or otherwise, don't have a fully fleshed out game world or a sense of history. Off the top of my head, I can only think of a few. Baten Kaitos, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy XII. But you know what games of this type tend to have in common? It's a strong story focus. In other words, exactly the thing that Matt says isn't important to Zelda. You can't have it both ways. Either story is important or it isn't. To the extent that story matters, Breath of the Wild is that much worse off for half-assing its story. And if it doesn't matter, Matt's expectations of deep lore and a detailed backstory make no sense. Nope, I'm not seeing it. I'll admit the game is pretty. Most Zelda games have been quite nice looking. Skyward Sword, which used to be my least favorite, was possibly one of the best looking. His in-example almost made me break out laughing. This kind of thing should be a baseline expectation for one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, especially for a game that was in development for 5 years. And just before this, Matt was talking about how the game has almost no murals or large-scale art assets in ruins or shrines. That would have been above and beyond. Not this. Sorry to stop again so soon, but what? Since when have Zelda characters ever looked mass-produced or soulless? Zelda has been one of the best franchises ever in terms of how unique and interesting its NPCs are, at least since Ocarina of Time, 2 decades ago. Did Matt get a concussion sometime during the last 6 years and forget every other Zelda game he's played? Wow. Maybe I should have expected something like this after the Sonic Dreams Collection review, but wow. This is just so wrong. It's shallow, lazy, and topical, none of which characterizes Matt's work at its best. You know, every video creator who works from a script has a point where they read what they've written and consider whether it's worth saying. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm actually astonished that this made it past editor Matt. He's not making a point here or saying anything meaningful. It's just a lame sex joke. Of all the things that make me cringe about this video, the fact that so many commenters thought this joke was cool is probably the cringiest. He might as well be cracking wise about Zelda's yoga pants encased ass. That's the level we're on here. Does he mean a reasonable amount from the perspective of being fun, or enough to upgrade Link's item slots adequately? The first is completely subjective, but I think they overdid it quite a bit. As for the second, that's completely based on the upgrade system requiring exponentially more seeds with each upgrade, and it could have easily been reduced substantially while still ensuring that the average player's upgrade potential remained the same. No, the real reason there are 900 Korok seeds is the same reason Super Mario Odyssey had 880 unique Power Moons. It's a big number, and it makes the game look like it's full of content. The fact that the content is shallow and may bore you after a while doesn't factor into the marketing, of course. That being said, I wouldn't pity the people who collected all of them for torturing themselves. It's their choice, and they must have liked something about it. People have spent countless hours doing frustrating, repetitive things in video games. Just look at Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. Matt's claim that Breath of the Wild is at its best when it's restricted is a bit at odds with his effusive praise for the game's freedom, isn't it? But if you think about what he's saying at this point, you can kind of see what he really wants. He wants a bunch of linear structured levels that can be visited in any order, without the freedom to bypass parts of those levels. Well, I'm sorry, Matt, but that's not what a sandbox is. That's what Mega Man X is, or Demon's Souls, or lots of other games that still maintain linearity in the short and medium term, which Breath of the Wild doesn't. And just as story and backstory are tied together, freedom to explore in order to find levels, and freedom to explore within levels are as well. Actually, different people want different things. The ceaseless tide of gushing praise for this game certainly shows that, in spite of its distinct lack of cut-down-tree moments, lots of players are in love with it. If Matt's talking about himself here, then fine, but he should describe it as something personal, not imply, as he often does, that this is some universal truth about art. First of all, the fact that bokoblins sit around talking, hunt for food, and so on has nothing to do with combat, so including that on a list of unique features is pretty disingenuous. I agree that bokoblins have lots of responses to things that Link does, but that's not enemy variety. It's just another facet of Link's variety of attacks. The enemy variety in Breath of the Wild is terrible, and encounters are horribly repetitive. You can't get around that by saying that the one type of enemy you fight thousands of is capable of half a dozen different moves. In previous Zelda games, each new enemy had a new appearance and different behavior, as well as unique attacks. Give a bokoblin a different spear, and it's still the same monster. It's a cheap, lazy solution. Matt mentions that certain kinds of Octoroks take the place of Dodongos, Deku Scrubs, etc., but they don't, because each previous generation had its own version of those things with unique qualities. Dodongos in Ocarina of Time were huge lumbering creatures with lots of health, who would spin around to knock you over with their tails. In Twilight Princess, they were spindly and weak, and they would skitter across the walls to ambush you. Reducing them to the enemy you defeat by throwing a bomb in its mouth is dismissive, and shows that you don't appreciate earlier Zelda enemies, or games for that matter, for what they really were. Oh, and by the way, if they'd only had more development time is a hell of a thing to say for a game Nintendo spent 5 years making. If something is lacking from Breath of the Wild, it's most likely because they didn't think of it or rejected it, not because they didn't have the time. Ah, good old slippery slope argument. I wondered when you'd show up. I agree that having different enemy types for every camp would be ridiculous, but having more than 6 common enemy types isn't, and Breath of the Wild doesn't do either. Pointing out that there's a line past which you don't bother making the game more complicated apparently distracts Matt's attention from the fact that Breath of the Wild is nowhere near that line. There are people, like Matt, who are satisfied with what they got. There are other people who were disappointed by the combat, but I think both parties would have been happier with more enemies. Matt says that the feeling of having enough is subjective, and it is, but what makes him think that his satisfaction with the content is enough to prove that it's unreasonable for someone else to expect more? This is certainly true for a lot of games, but for 3D Zelda games specifically, I'd say no, it isn't. Zelda games since Ocarina of Time have had very tightly designed worlds with lots of interactive scenery. Not all of it is useful to the player, but a lot of it is hazardous to the player, which is interesting in its own way, and something that Breath of the Wild, with its easy shortcuts around the landscape, lacks. This is another case of Matt, and many other people, underrating the previous games. Could you use every tree in a game like Ocarina of Time? Actually, yes. You could roll into them for rupees, hearts, bugs, and even rare items like golden sculptulas. In fact, this was better than Breath of the Wild, because these were often unique surprises, whereas in Breath of the Wild every tree is just a potential pile of lumber. One of Breath of the Wild's biggest flaws is how often it loses that sense of surprise and falls into your typical sandbox rut of beat up enemies, grab loot, collect crafting ingredients, make food and armor, lather, rinse, repeat. For once, I couldn't agree more. Matt talks about transcending being a bunch of connected rooms, but that's been central to Zelda since at least Majora's Mask. The Divine Beasts are this game's lone concession to people who wanted a more traditional Zelda experience, and it's a grudging concession that shows how little interest this game's designers actually had in long-form dungeon exploration. Breath of the Wild is a sandbox, not a Zelda game. That's what it comes down to. The parts that make it a Zelda game are the weakest parts of the experience, and what people loved about it, the overworld exploration, the combat system, the abundance of loot, are established qualities of open-world games, with just a bit of extra Nintendo polish. Matt once harshly criticized BioShock Infinite for being an attempt at a thoughtful story set in the dumb, meat-brained context of a first-person shooter just so it would sell. I have a similar criticism for Breath of the Wild. It's a clever and inventive open-world sandbox that was forced into the Zelda franchise just so it would sell to Nintendo fans, many of whom will take pretty much whatever they're given and fawn over it. Matt is far from the first person I've heard giving this opinion, but he's probably the most prominent. Regardless of who says it, this is wrong. The shrines in Breath of the Wild were made with a design philosophy completely different from the classic Zelda style. Connecting a bunch of them together would make a Portal-style obstacle course, not a dungeon. For one thing, classic Zelda dungeons, with very few exceptions, feature a mixture of puzzles and enemies in the same room. Solving puzzles in a vacuum, the way most shrines operate, isn't comparable, and Breath of the Wild's enemy count is so low that it wouldn't be able to evoke the same feeling as past Zelda dungeons anyway. Also, as Matt mentions, shrines have no individual style or theming whatsoever, just different mechanics. Many of them even have similarly sized and shaped rooms. Something as basic as room geometry is standardized rather than custom-made. Skyward Sword's dungeons were actually fantastic in this respect. It's an aspect of that game that many players drastically underrated, including me for a long time. Breath of the Wild fails to scratch that dungeon-exploring itch many old fans have, which is fine, but don't pretend that really this game has plenty of dungeon content, guys, honest. The focus wasn't on dungeon crawling, and it seriously shows. This is just ridiculous. The game didn't need an excuse for showing Link's memories this way, because Link and the player aren't identical. Link could be reliving past memories that he didn't forget so much as just not think about all the time. You know, like a normal person. The amnesia isn't an excuse for the story sequences. It's an excuse for tutorials and exposition. This is a shame, because there are many ways that the player could be led around without having every major NPC give Link an info dump. It would also make Link seem more like a real person, something that every other 3D Zelda has managed to do at least a little, Wind Waker being a particular standout in this regard. They really didn't care about this story, as we'll soon see. Not that Matt appreciates story anyway, so maybe that's why he's willing to hand-wave cliché plot devices and non-existent character development. Freedom of choice in sitting there and watching non-interactive cutscenes in a unique order? Why would that matter? These cutscenes are short and mostly self-contained, and even when they aren't, they often retread the same points as earlier ones. The overall plot itself isn't terribly interesting, and chopping it up doesn't make it stronger. Seriously, tell me one time that your take on this game actually changed partway through because of which memory you saw first. It's only a tough decision to chop up your game's story if you really care about saying something with your story, which they didn't. Calling them brave for allowing flashbacks to appear out of order is just sycophantic. They did it to add interest to a lackluster story, not to evoke the potential inherent in the story. Wrong again. This is only true if you think bookish is the same as wise. Zelda has often been characterized as a curious girl who wants to learn about the world. She's eloquent, thoughtful, and wise beyond her years. Even in Wind Waker, Tetra was very bright, often thinking of solutions to problems that completely stumped Link. Heck, now that I think about it, Skyward Sword Zelda is bookish. Just look at her room. The difference is that Breath of the Wild is the first game to brag about Zelda being smart, while the previous games were more subtle about it. It's called the Triforce of Wisdom, not the Triforce of Studiousness, and turning Princess Zelda into Hermione Granger in yoga pants doesn't make her a stronger character. So, Matt has just given his final remarks to the internet jury, and I think it's fair for me to give an alternate perspective on what this game signifies. Freedom is a very loaded word. I think Matt used it with the full knowledge that it sounds good, regardless of the implications that pure freedom has for gameplay. A choose-your-own-adventure book gives you total freedom to experience its content in any order too, but I've never seen anyone try to claim a place for that kind of thing in the pantheon of great literature. Matt praises Breath of the Wild for being single-mindedly dedicated to nonlinearity, without questioning whether that's actually a worthy goal. That's probably because he enjoyed the game, so he sees no need to question its premise. Yet it's his very enjoyment of the open-world sandbox he was given that limits him in his attempts to understand people who don't like open-world sandboxes and what they stand for in gaming. And to show you what you lose when you abandon traditional storytelling, I'm actually going to cite one of the least linear Zelda games there is, Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask has a lot in common with Breath of the Wild, both superficially and on a deeper level. It has 4 major dungeons, each focused around one major puzzle concept. It respawns the enemies you fight once every several in-game days, and leaves you with the sense that any progress you make in this world is temporary. It lets you roam around an open world and experience lots of small pieces of side content, as well as being able to finish dungeons in just about any order you like. It even has a weapon, just one though, that breaks after a little while and leaves you with an inferior sword to use against your foes. Where Majora's Mask differs from Breath of the Wild is in how it sees the world and the player's role in it. Breath of the Wild has a huge world, but oddly a lot of it seems to have been designed for Link's personal convenience. More than 100 huge underground complexes were made by monks centuries ago just to test his skills, even at things that have almost nothing to do with defeating Ganon. You find helpful NPCs all over the place to sell or give you things and lend useful advice. He appears in every one of the story flashbacks you run into, and even though he has almost no personality, his relationship with Zelda is treated as the most important aspect of the game's plot. The game makes a big deal about the divine beasts and how much havoc they're causing, but it's always a very distant threat, and it doesn't seem to keep the villages you visit from being peaceful and basically untroubled. This is supposed to be a post-apocalyptic setting, yet it's strangely idyllic. There's nothing either mechanically or emotionally to keep you from dithering in shrines or out in the wilderness for hours, instead of trying to help people, because when you get right down to it, they don't need your help. Out of 76 major side quests in Breath of the Wild, most involve either just doing a small favor for someone, like cooking, or hunting monsters who aren't posing an immediate threat to anyone. Even when you run across something that seems like it might be somewhat menacing, like wife washed away, you go out to look for her and... oh, she's fine. Singing, in fact. No big deal. This is the downside of total player freedom. To make it stick, you have to refrain from ever pressuring the player into doing something major. The result is a game that feels like very little of it matters. All the sadness and seriousness is shoved into optional flashbacks of events that took place a century ago. The player doesn't participate in it at all, and almost none of it has any relevance to the minute-by-minute gameplay. You might as well be watching a movie. By contrast, let's take a look at the world and story of Majora's Mask. Termina is nowhere near as large as Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, but it's so full of life and activity that it seems huge. In the 3 days you spend there, so many different things are happening that you need a notebook to keep track of them all, which the game thoughtfully provides early on, although it is possible to miss it. And almost anywhere you go, there are people suffering and in need of help. A poor farm girl whose cattle are being stolen, an infant Goron who's been separated from his father, a whole kingdom cursed to endlessly relive the last days of a catastrophic war, and many others. Helping these people is incidental to Link's quest to save Termina, but in many cases it's not optional. Instead, it's part of the overall story, and it makes Link feel like a real hero, someone who travels from place to place righting the wrongs and bringing hope back to the people. By subjecting the player to a strict time limit, Majora's Mask also creates a sense of urgency in the player, and in many cases you end up witnessing the tragic results of stories you didn't help to fix just by exploring a new area late in the 3-day cycle, something you're bound to do several times over the course of the game. What Link does or doesn't do in the course of Majora's Mask matters a lot. If he doesn't defeat Goat in Snowhead Temple, the Gorons will all freeze to death. If he doesn't rescue the Deku Princess, an innocent creature will be killed because of a misunderstanding. Even in optional side quests like the events at Romani Ranch, the consequences of not acting are grim and cruelly ironic. Majora's Mask takes its story and its world seriously. Breath of the Wild ignores its own story and doesn't care whether you're invested or not. Matt gushed in his video about grass waving and clouds occluding the sun behind you, because he said that made the world feel truly alive. But those minutiae don't do nearly as much to draw the player in as strong characters and a sense of purpose within the game world, even in the absence of a focused linear story. Fans of Breath of the Wild don't rave about the play of light on leaves, or how realistic the wolves act. They rave about Mipha, and Zelda's relatable experience of failure, and other things like that. It's the details of character and personality that make a fictional universe appealing, and much as Matt would like to take story out of the picture, story is what those details are a part of. Even the shallow and anemic story that Breath of the Wild has is more memorable than the shrines, or the endless enemy camps, or the forgettable boss battles. If anything, the fan reaction to Breath of the Wild stands as proof that story and characters matter to Zelda, and that marginalizing them any more than they already have been could be the kiss of death for this series. I didn't start out as a Zelda fan. Back when Majora's Mask came out, and I played it for the first time, I actually hated it. I couldn't get used to the strict time limit and having to keep track of so many different things, and I stopped playing it about halfway through. It was only several years later, when I went back and tried to replay it, that I started to see the appeal. And that's when my opinion of the game started drifting toward what now seems to be the critical consensus, that it's possibly the best Zelda game, and one of the best games of all time, period. What I dislike about Breath of the Wild, and Matt's whole concept of pure freedom in general, is that it seems like the kind of thing that tween-age me would have found superficially appealing, but it does nothing for current me. If Majora's Mask had worked like that, I might have finished it on my first try. Don't like that one boss? Skip it. Who cares? Can't deal with the tough time limit? Well, okay. We'll just get rid of it. Take all the time you like. There's no hurry. But when I came back to it years later, features like this would grate on my nerves and make me wonder why the game would be so determined to let me break out of an experience that I chose for myself to begin with. I know for a fact that I would feel this way, because it's exactly how I felt when the 3DS port of Majora's Mask came out, complete with lots of supposedly necessary concessions to players' impatience, changes that call attention to themselves, and make the game feel more fake than any amount of cheesy dialogue. Breath of the Wild gave me a very similar feeling. Before it, Zelda had always felt like a very unique franchise, one that was dedicated to doing its own thing despite industry trends. Now, instead of following the well-worn template of the classic 3D Zelda game, it's following the equally well-worn, but less unique, template of an open-world sandbox game. Matt didn't completely spare Breath of the Wild from criticism, but what he did say was often pretty weak, more along the lines of, "this could be better," rather than "this wasn't good." And it's hard to imagine that a game that receives so many perfect 10s from review sites will be seen by its creator as something in need of improvement. If anything, they're probably less likely to try hard in the future. For people who love sandboxes, Zelda has a bright future, but for people who loved Zelda for what it once was, this may be the end of the line. The best we can do at this point is remember classic Zelda, play the games that are still inspired by it, and hope that someday Nintendo may have another change of heart. After all, a man can dream, can't he?